speed it up. The inheritance paperwork should already be in motion, my daughter-in-law whispered just a few feet behind me, thinking the soft hum of condolences and organ music would cover her voice. But I heard every word as clearly as if she had spoken them into my ear. And in that moment, standing beside my husband's casket after 46 years of marriage, I realized they hadn't just been grieving. They had been waiting. I didn't turn around. I didn't let my face change. I simply kept my eyes on the polished wood in front of me, the same calm expression I had practiced for decades through disappointments and quiet sacrifices, because something inside me had shifted, something cold and steady, like a door closing without a sound. I'm Margaret Whitmore, 71 years old, and I buried my husband, Edward, on a gray Thursday morning in late October. The kind of morning where the air feels thin and the sky presses down just a little too low. People came in dark coats and soft voices, placing gentle hands on my shoulder, telling me how sorry they were, how kind he had been, how much he would be missed. I nodded, thanked them, accepted their sympathy like I was supposed to, but all I could hear, over and over again, was that sentence, speed it up, as if my husband's life had been nothing more than a delay in someone else's plans. Daniel stood to my right, my only son, his posture stiff, his eyes avoiding mine. He had always been taller than me, even as a teenager, but in that moment he felt like a stranger standing in a borrowed suit. And beside him was Ashley, my daughter-in-law, her black dress perfectly fitted, her makeup untouched by tears, her hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm, as if she were the one holding him together. I watched her from the corner of my eye as she leaned closer to him again, her lips barely moving, and though I couldn't catch every word this time, I didn't need to. I already knew the tone, the urgency, the quiet calculation behind it. I had heard that tone before, just never directed so openly at me, or rather, at what I represented. After the service ended, people began to drift away, one by one, their footsteps fading into the gravel path outside the chapel. The scent of lilies still heavy in the air. I remained where I was, my hand resting lightly on the edge of the casket, not gripping it, not clinging, just there, as if I were acknowledging something final without making a scene of it. I had loved Edward in a quiet, steady way, the kind of love that doesn't need to be announced. We built our life together piece by piece. A modest house just outside of town, a small garden he insisted on tending himself even in his later years, a routine that felt unremarkable to anyone else but meant everything to me. And now he was gone, and before the ground had even settled above him, there were already plans being made, decisions being whispered, timelines being pushed forward. "Mom, we should probably head back soon," Daniel said finally, his voice careful, as if he were speaking to someone fragile. I turned to look at him, really look at him, searching for something familiar, something of the boy who used to run into the kitchen after school and tell me about his day. But all I found was hesitation, and behind it, something else, something quieter but far more troubling. Agreement. I gave a small nod. Nothing more. Ashley offered me a polite smile, the kind you give a distant relative. "We'll take care of everything, Margaret," she said, her tone smooth, reassuring, practiced. I held her gaze for a second longer than necessary, just long enough to let the words settle between us. Then I looked away, because there was no need to respond. Not yet. The drive back to the house was silent, the kind of silence that isn't peaceful but filled with things left unsaid. I sat in the back seat, watching the familiar streets pass by, each corner carrying a memory, each storefront a reminder of a life that had felt stable just days ago. When we pulled into the driveway, I noticed something immediately. The front porch light was on, even though it was still early afternoon. Edward had always been particular about that. Lights off during the day, no exceptions. I stepped out of the car slowly, taking in the sight of the house I had lived in for over 3 decades. The paint slightly faded, the mailbox leaning just a bit to the left, the same as always, and yet it felt different, not empty, not yet, but no longer mine in the way it had been before. As we walked inside, Ashley moved ahead of me, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. She paused briefly in the entryway, glancing around not with grief, but with assessment, like someone taking inventory. I noticed it, the way her eyes lingered on the staircase, the living room, the hallway leading to the study, and in that moment, I understood something with absolute clarity. This wasn't about mourning. It wasn't about loss. It was about transition, about moving pieces from one place to another, and I was just another piece in the way. I set my purse down on the small table by the door, the same place I had set it every day for years, and without a word, I walked past them both, deeper into the house, my steps slow, deliberate, because if there was one thing I had learned in 71 years, it was this. When people think you are too quiet to notice, too broken to act, that is when they make their first mistake, and I intended to let them believe it for just a little while longer. I did not go to the bedroom that afternoon, not right away. Instead, I stood in the kitchen where the faint smell of coffee still lingered, even though no one had brewed a fresh pot since Edward's last morning. His mug was still in the sink, a thin ring of dried coffee marking where it had sat untouched for days. I picked it up slowly, running my fingers along the rim as if it might still be warm, as if time had paused and I had simply stepped out of the room for a moment. But it had not. Time had moved forward without asking me, without waiting. Just like everything else now. From the hallway, I could hear Ashley's voice again, softer this time, but no less deliberate. "We should start organizing things soon. There is a lot to go through," she said. And there was a pause, the kind that waits for agreement. Daniel responded with a low murmur, too quiet for me to catch every word, but I did not need to. I knew that tone. The same tone he used as a child when he was unsure but willing to be guided, except now the guidance was not coming from me. I set the mug back down exactly where I had found it, aligning it carefully with the edge of the counter, a small act of control in a house that already felt like it was shifting under my feet. I moved toward the living room, my steps slow, not because I was weak, but because I was listening, observing. Ashley stood near the staircase, her phone in her hand, scrolling, pausing, then typing something quickly. When she noticed me, she slipped it into her purse with a practiced ease and offered a gentle smile. "You should rest, Margaret. It has been a long day," she said, her voice wrapped in concern that did not quite reach her eyes. I nodded once, acknowledging the suggestion without accepting it. "I am fine," I replied, my voice steady, and for a brief moment, something flickered across her expression, not irritation exactly, but adjustment, as if she were recalculating. Daniel shifted beside her, his hands in his pockets, avoiding eye contact again. "Mom, we can handle everything for now," he added, and there it was, the word everything, stretched thin and vague, covering more than it should. I looked at him, really looked this time, noticing the small details I had overlooked before, the way he stood slightly behind Ashley, the way his shoulders angled toward her, not me, as if the center of his world had quietly moved, and I had not noticed until now. "Of course," I said, because arguing would have been pointless, because raising my voice would have only confirmed whatever version of me they had already decided on. Instead, I turned away, walking toward the hallway that led to Edward's study. The door was slightly ajar, just enough to reveal that something inside had changed. I pushed it open gently, the familiar scent of old books and polished wood greeting me. But the desk was not as I had left it. Papers had been shifted, a drawer slightly open, and on the corner of the desk, where Edward had always kept his leather-bound notebook, there was now an empty space. I stood there for a long moment, taking it in, not reacting, just observing, because it was no longer about a single comment overheard in a chapel. It was about a pattern, small movements, quiet decisions, things being rearranged without me, around me, as if I were already gone. I stepped further into the room, closing the door softly behind me. And for the first time since the funeral, I allowed myself to think not about what I had lost, but about what was being taken, and more importantly, how carefully it was being done, which told me everything I needed to know. This was not impulsive. This was planned. And if it was planned, then it could be unraveled. I reached out and touched the surface of the desk, my fingers tracing the grain of the wood, grounding myself in something real, something that had not yet been moved or claimed. And in that quiet, undisturbed space, I made a decision, not out of anger, not out of grief, but out of clarity. I would not confront them. Not yet. I would not ask questions they had already prepared answers for. Instead, I would listen, I would watch, and I would let them continue. Because people reveal far more when they believe they have already won, and right now, that is exactly what they believed. The next morning arrived too quietly, the kind of silence that feels deliberate, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I woke before sunrise out of habit, the same way I had for decades, expecting to hear Edward moving down the hallway or the soft creak of the floorboards as he made his way to the kitchen. But there was nothing, just the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a car passing somewhere beyond the neighborhood. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, letting the stillness settle over me, not fighting it, not pushing it away, just acknowledging it as something that now belonged to my life. When I finally got up, I moved through the house slowly, noticing details I had never paid attention to before. The way the morning light fell unevenly across the dining room table, the faint scratch on the wall near the staircase that Daniel had made as a child, the slight tilt of the picture frame in the hallway that Edward used to straighten. Every few days without saying a word, small things, ordinary things, but they felt sharper now, more defined, as if they were trying to tell me something I had missed. When I reached the kitchen, I paused, because something was different, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me. The drawer where Edward kept his documents was closed more tightly than usual. The handle aligned perfectly with the cabinet edge, too perfectly. Edward had never cared about alignment. He cared about access. I stepped closer, my fingers resting lightly on the cool metal handle, and for a second, I hesitated. Not because I was unsure, but because I already knew what I would find. I opened the drawer slowly, the soft glide of wood against wood breaking the silence. Inside, the folders were arranged differently, not in the loose, familiar way Edward kept them, but stacked, categorized, reduced. I scanned them quickly, property records, insurance papers, tax documents, all present, all accounted for, except one, the folder labeled in Edward's handwriting with a simple word, personal. It was gone. I closed the drawer without making a sound, my expression unchanged, my breathing steady, because the absence of that folder told me more than its presence ever could have. It was not lost. It was taken, and it was taken recently. I turned toward the doorway just as Ashley's voice floated in from the living room. I called the attorney this morning. We should be able to move things along by next week, she said, her tone light, efficient, as if she were discussing a routine appointment. Daniel responded after a brief pause. That fast. There was something in his voice, a flicker of surprise. But not resistance. Never resistance. Ashley gave a small laugh, the kind that smooths over discomfort. There is no reason to delay. Everything is straightforward, she replied, and I stood there, just out of sight, letting their words settle into place, piece by piece. Next week. Everything, straightforward. I stepped into the living room then, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to make my presence known. Ashley turned toward me immediately, her expression shifting into polite concern. Good morning, Margaret. Did you sleep at all? She asked, as if sleep were the only thing that mattered, as if nothing else had already begun to unravel. Enough, I said, my voice even, and I moved past them toward the window, looking out at the front yard where Edward used to stand every Saturday morning with a cup of coffee in his hand, checking the mail even when he knew it had not arrived yet. A small ritual, simple, predictable, real, behind me. I could feel them watching me, waiting for something, a question, a reaction, anything that would give them a sense of where I stood, but I gave them nothing, because that was the only advantage I had left, uncertainty, and I intended to keep it. I rested my hand lightly against the window frame, grounding myself again, and in that quiet moment, everything became clear. The missing folder, the early phone call, the urgency. In Ashley's voice, this was not a sudden shift after Edward's passing. This had started before, quietly, carefully, while I was still setting the table, still making dinner, still believing that the life we had built was intact. I turned slightly, just enough to catch my reflection in the glass. An older woman with silver hair and steady eyes, not broken, not lost, just aware, and awareness, I realized, was far more powerful than grief, because grief could be ignored, dismissed, managed, but awareness changed everything. I stepped away from the window then, moving toward the hallway with the same measured pace, because there was no need to rush. Not anymore. They were moving quickly, too quickly, and that was their weakness, not mine. And for the first time since I heard that whisper in the chapel, I allowed myself a small, almost invisible thought. If they were already this certain, then they had already made their second mistake. That afternoon, I did something I had not done in years. I sat down at Edward's desk and allowed myself to remember, not the last few days, not the quiet rearranging of drawers or the careful conversations happening just out of earshot, but the years before any of this had begun, the years when everything had felt solid, dependable, real. I opened the top drawer slowly, not searching this time, just observing what remained. The faint scent of his cologne still clinging to the wood, subtle but unmistakable. And for a moment I closed my eyes, letting it settle around me. Edward had never been a man of grand gestures. He did not speak in dramatic promises or sweeping declarations. Instead, he built things, quietly, patiently, piece by piece. Our home, our savings, our routines, even our marriage. Everything he did carried the same steady intention. I could still see him at this very desk late at night, glasses low on his nose, reviewing documents with a kind of focus that never seemed forced, as if he understood something about the future that the rest of us ignored. Details matter, Margaret, he used to say without looking up. It is always the details that protect you. At the time, I had smiled, nodding, half listening while I cleared dishes or folded laundry, trusting that whatever needed to be handled would be. Because he was there, because he always had been, I reached for the second drawer and opened it carefully. Inside were old envelopes, neatly tied with a thin ribbon, letters from years ago, handwritten notes, birthday cards, things we had kept not because they were valuable, but because they were ours. I lifted the bundle gently, my fingers brushing against the worn paper, and a memory surfaced without warning. A summer afternoon nearly 20 years ago, Daniel was still in college, and Edward had just returned from meeting with his attorney. He had stood in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, watching me as I prepared dinner. There had been something thoughtful in his expression, something I did not question at the time. If anything ever happens to me, he had said, his voice calm, almost casual, you do not let anyone rush you. Not decisions, not paperwork, nothing. I had laughed softly, brushing it off. You are not going anywhere, I told him, and he had smiled. But it was not a dismissive smile. It was the kind that comes from knowing more than you say. Just promise me, he had added, and I had nodded without thinking, because it seemed like a simple request, something distant, something that belonged to a future I was not ready to imagine. I placed the letters back exactly where I had found them, the ribbon tied neatly again, and sat there for a long moment, letting the memory settle into place alongside everything I had seen over the past 2 days. The missing folder, the early phone call, the urgency, the quiet confidence in Ashley's voice, it all began to align, not as separate incidents, but as parts of something larger, something that had been unfolding long before I noticed it. I leaned back slightly in the chair, my eyes moving across the room, taking in every detail. The bookshelf Edward had built himself, the small clock on the wall that ticked steadily without pause, the framed photograph of the three of us from years ago, Daniel standing between us, smiling without hesitation, without distance, and I felt something shift again, not grief, not anger, but recognition, the kind that does not ask for permission, that does not soften its edges. Edward had known, not everything, not the specifics, but enough to leave a warning, enough to remind me that time, patience, and attention were not weaknesses, they were tools. I stood up slowly, pushing the chair back into place with care, because nothing in this room felt accidental. Nothing had ever been. And if Edward had trusted the details to protect me, then I would start there, not with confrontation, not with accusations, but with observation, with precision. I moved toward the door, my steps steady, my mind clear, because for the first time since the funeral, I was no longer reacting to what was happening around me. I was beginning to understand it. And understanding, I realized, was the first step toward taking everything back. The house felt different that evening. Not quieter, not emptier, but occupied in a way that did not belong to me. As if decisions were being made in the walls themselves, quietly settling into place without ever needing to be spoken aloud. I stayed in the background, moving through familiar rooms with the same calm rhythm I had always had. Making tea, folding a blanket, adjusting a picture frame that did not truly need adjusting. Small actions that allowed me to observe without being noticed. Ashley and Daniel had taken over the dining room table, papers spread out in careful stacks, a laptop open between them. The glow of the screen reflecting in Ashley's eyes as she leaned forward, focused, deliberate. I passed by once, just once, and I saw enough. Columns of numbers, headings, words like transfer, asset, timeline, and something else, something that made my steps slow just slightly. Projected sale. I did not stop. I did not ask. I simply continued into the kitchen as if I had not seen anything at all, because by now I understood that information was not something they would give me freely. It was something I would have to take by noticing what they thought I would ignore. Later, as the sun dipped lower and the light in the house turned softer, I returned to the hallway, pausing just out of sight of the dining room. Their voices clearer now, less guarded. If we list it within the next 2 weeks, we can still catch the end of the season, Ashley said, her tone confident, already moving ahead of the moment. Daniel hesitated. I could hear it in the slight pause before he spoke. It just feels fast, he admitted, and for a brief second, I felt something stir. Not hope, but recognition, the part of him that had not fully disappeared. Ashley responded quickly, not dismissive, but persuasive. It is practical. Daniel, the longer it sits, the more it costs. Taxes, maintenance, everything adds up. Her voice softened at the end, not out of kindness, but precision. She knew exactly where to press. I stepped forward then, letting the floorboard creak just enough to announce my presence. Both of them turned toward me instantly, the conversation stopping mid-thought. Ashley closed the laptop halfway, her hand resting on it as if she had simply paused, not concealed. Margaret, we were just going over some details, she said smoothly. As if the explanation had already been prepared, I nodded once, my gaze steady, moving briefly from her to Daniel and back again. I assumed so, I replied, my voice even, and I let the silence stretch just a moment longer than comfortable, not long enough to create tension. Just long enough to remind them that I was not as absent as they might prefer. Daniel shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping lightly against the edge of the table, a habit he had when he was uncertain. Ashley remained still, composed, her posture unchanged. I took a step closer, not toward the table, but toward the window beside it, looking out at the fading light. Edward always liked this time of day, I said quietly, not as a question, not as a statement that required response, just a fact placed into the room. Daniel nodded faintly, but Ashley said nothing, and that told me more than any answer could have. I turned back toward them after a moment, offering a small, polite smile, the kind that reveals nothing. You should not let things sit unfinished, I added, watching carefully as the words settled. Ashley's expression did not change, but there was a flicker, a brief shift in her eyes, something between surprise and confirmation. Daniel looked at me more directly this time, searching, perhaps, for something he could not quite name. I did not give it to him. Instead, I stepped away, leaving them with exactly what I intended, uncertainty, because now I knew, not just what they were planning, but how far they believed they had already gone, and more importantly, how little they thought I understood. And as I moved back toward the hallway, my steps quiet, measured, I realized that the most valuable thing I had at that moment was not evidence, not yet, but timing. And if Edward had been right about anything, it was this. When people rush, they make mistakes, and Ashley was already moving faster than she should have. The following morning, I changed something small, something they would not question. I woke later than usual, not by accident, but by choice, allowing the house to move without me for a while, to settle into whatever rhythm they were trying to create. When I finally stepped into the kitchen, Ashley was already there, dressed neatly, her phone propped against a coffee mug as she scrolled through something with quiet focus. She looked up briefly, her expression polite but distant. Good morning, Margaret, she said, as if we were acquaintances sharing a space rather than family sharing a home. I offered a faint smile, moving slowly toward the counter. Good morning, I replied, my voice softer than before, just enough to suggest fatigue, just enough to give her something to believe. I poured myself a cup of coffee, my hands steady, but my movements slightly slower than usual, deliberate, measured. I could feel her watching me without turning, assessing, adjusting, the way she always did when something did not fit her expectations. You should not worry about the house right now, she added after a moment, her tone gentle, almost rehearsed. Daniel and I will take care of everything. I nodded again, lowering my gaze slightly, as if the words brought relief instead of clarity. That might be best, I said quietly, and this time, I saw it, the smallest shift in her posture, a subtle easing, as if a piece had fallen into place exactly where she wanted it. I carried my coffee into the living room, sitting down in Edward's chair for the first time since the funeral. The fabric still held the shape of him in ways no one else would notice. I let out a slow breath, not heavy, not dramatic, just enough to complete the picture they were beginning to form of me. Someone tired, someone willing to step back, someone who would not interfere. Later that afternoon, Daniel approached me cautiously, standing just inside the doorway, as if unsure whether to come closer. "Mom, Ashley found a few options for you," he said, his voice careful again. That same tone he used when he wanted something to sound like a suggestion instead of a decision. I looked up at him, my expression open, patient. "Options," I repeated, giving him space to continue. "Places, communities, smaller homes, somewhere easier to manage," he explained, avoiding specifics, avoiding eye contact. I held his gaze a second longer than he expected, then let it go, as if I were considering the idea rather than questioning its origin. "That sounds thoughtful," I said slowly, choosing each word with intention, not agreeing, not refusing, just allowing him to believe that the conversation was moving forward. Ashley appeared behind him almost immediately, as if she had been waiting just out of sight, her timing precise. "We just want what is best for you," she added, her voice smooth, reassuring. I set my coffee down carefully, folding my hands in my lap, my posture relaxed, unthreatening. "Of course," I said, and for the first time, I allowed a small pause, just enough to draw their attention fully. "I trust you both to handle things properly." The words settled between us, and I watched as they took them in, not hearing what I meant, only what they expected. Daniel nodded, relieved. Ashley smiled, satisfied. And in that moment, I knew the shift was complete. They no longer saw me as an obstacle. They saw me as someone who had stepped aside, someone who would not question, someone who would follow. And that was exactly what I needed them to believe, because as they turned away, already discussing timelines again, already moving forward with a confidence that came too easily, I remained where I was, still, quiet, unnoticed. And for the first time since this began, I was no longer reacting to their plans. I was shaping mine, slowly, carefully, and entirely out of their sight. The next 2 days unfolded exactly the way I expected, quietly, efficiently, and just a little too quickly. Ashley began making calls early in the morning, her voice low but purposeful as she moved from room to room, never staying in one place for too long, always keeping things in motion. Daniel followed her lead without question, checking documents, responding to emails, occasionally glancing in my direction as if to confirm that I was still where they had left me, still calm, still cooperative. I gave them no reason to think otherwise. I spent my time in the simplest ways, sitting by the window, folding laundry that did not need folding, rereading old magazines without turning the pages, small, harmless routines that made me appear exactly as they needed me to be, distracted, passive, removed. But beneath that stillness, I was paying attention to everything. The timing of their conversations, the way Ashley lowered her voice when certain topics came up, the moments Daniel hesitated before agreeing to something, those small pauses that revealed more than his words ever could. On the third morning, Ashley left the house earlier than usual, her heels clicking quickly down the front steps, her voice brisk as she spoke into her phone before the door had even fully closed. Daniel remained inside, moving more slowly, less certain without her presence directing the pace. I waited until I heard the sound of his car engine starting in the driveway, a few minutes after hers. Before I stood up from the chair by the window, the house fell into a different kind of silence then, not the quiet of absence, but the quiet of opportunity. I walked directly to the dining room table, where they had left everything exactly as it had been the night before, papers stacked in neat piles, the laptop closed but not put away, a pen resting across the top of a folder as if it had been set down mid-thought. I did not rush. I did not touch everything at once. I moved slowly, deliberately, starting with the top sheet of the nearest stack, property valuation estimates. Recent, detailed, already prepared for listing. I turned the page, then another, scanning quickly but carefully, absorbing what I needed without disturbing the order. Further down, I found what I had been expecting, a draft agreement, and signed, but complete, outlining the transfer of ownership pending final authorization. The language was precise, clinical, designed to move quickly. Once initiated, I set the papers back exactly as they had been, aligning each edge, each corner, leaving no sign that they had been touched. Then I opened the laptop, just enough to wake the screen. A password prompt appeared. I did not try to guess it. I did not need to. Instead, I noted the name of the document visible behind the lock screen. A partial title, but enough. Timeline execution plan. I closed the laptop gently, returning the pen to its original position, and stepped back, taking in the entire table as if I were seeing it for the first time. Everything was there, not hidden, not locked away, simply arranged under the assumption that I would not look closely enough to understand it. I left the room as quietly as I had entered, returning to the living room just as I heard Daniel's car pull away completely, the house settling back into stillness. I sat down again, folding my hands in my lap, my expression unchanged, but inside, everything had shifted. I now knew not just what they intended, but how they intended to do it, the structure, the timing, the order of steps, and more importantly, I knew where the gaps were, the places they had assumed no one would question. I leaned back slightly in the chair, letting that understanding settle into something steady, something usable, because this was no longer about suspicion or instinct. This was about confirmation, and confirmation meant that the next move would not be theirs, it would be mine. And when they walked back into this house later that day, expecting everything to remain exactly as they had left it, they would find that nothing had changed at all, which was precisely the point. That evening, I made a call they would never expect, not because it was dramatic, but because it was quiet, precise, and long overdue. I waited until I heard Ashley's voice in the kitchen and Daniel's footsteps upstairs before I stepped into Edward's study and closed the door behind me. The room felt different now, not empty, but steady, as if it had been waiting for me to return with purpose instead of memory. I sat down at the desk and reached for the small address book Edward had kept for years, the pages worn, the ink slightly faded, but the name still clear. I turned to the letter C and found it exactly where I knew it would be. Collins, James, attorney at law. I picked up the phone and dialed slowly, each number deliberate, each second stretching just enough to remind me that this moment mattered. The line rang twice before a calm, familiar voice answered. Collins speaking. I did not rush. I did not explain everything at once. I simply said my name. This is Margaret Whitmore. And there was a pause, not of confusion, but recognition. Mrs. Whitmore, he replied, his tone shifting slightly, more attentive now. I was very sorry to hear about Edward. I thanked him quietly, then let a brief silence settle before continuing. I believe it is time we reviewed everything he left behind. The words were simple, but I chose them carefully, because I was not asking, I was informing. There was another pause, longer this time, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different weight, something more cautious, more aware. I think that would be wise, he said, and in that moment, I knew, not everything, but enough to confirm that Edward had not left things unprotected, enough to understand that the details he had always spoken about were still there, waiting to be seen by someone who knew where to look. We arranged a meeting for the following morning, early, before the house would fully wake, before Ashley's plans could move any further ahead. I wrote the time down on a small piece of paper and slipped it into my pocket instead of leaving it on the desk. When I ended the call, I remained seated for a moment, my hand resting lightly on the surface of the desk, grounding myself in the quiet certainty that had replaced the uncertainty of the past few days. I stood up then, smoothing the front of my sweater as if nothing had changed, and stepped back into the hallway. Ashley glanced at me briefly from the kitchen, her expression unreadable for a split second before settling back into its usual composure. Daniel's voice drifted down from upstairs, asking something about a document, and she answered without hesitation, as if everything was already under control. I walked past them both without stopping, without speaking, carrying nothing visible, no papers, no evidence, no sign of what had just been set in motion, because the most important changes are the ones no one sees coming. And as I moved through the house that night, quiet, steady, exactly as they expected me to be, I knew that by the time they realized anything had shifted, it would already be too late to adjust. The next morning began earlier than any of them expected, before the sun had fully risen, before the house had a chance to settle into its usual rhythm. I dressed quietly, choosing the same neutral clothes I had worn the day before, nothing that would draw attention, nothing that would suggest change, and I left the house without making a sound. The front door closing behind me with a soft click that seemed louder in the stillness than it actually was. The air outside was crisp, the kind of morning that sharpens your thoughts whether you want it to or not. When I arrived at Mr. Collins's office, he was already waiting, standing near the window with a folder in his hands. His expression calm but focused. He did not waste time on small talk. He gestured for me to sit and placed the folder carefully on the desk between us. Edward was very thorough, he said, opening it slowly, and as the papers inside were revealed, everything that had felt uncertain over the past few days began to take shape. Not as fear, not as suspicion, but as fact. There were documents I had never seen, clauses I had never been told about, provisions written in precise legal language that carried more weight than any conversation I had overheard. And as he explained them, piece by piece, I listened without interrupting, without reacting, because this was not the moment for emotion. This was the moment for understanding. Nothing can be transferred without your direct approval, he said clearly, his eyes meeting mine to make sure I heard it. And if there is any attempt to pressure or misrepresent your consent, it triggers a full review of all assets. I nodded once, letting the words settle, not because they surprised me, but because they confirmed what Edward had always believed, that the details would matter when everything else became uncertain. When I returned home, the house looked exactly the same light filtering through the windows, the same quiet hum of activity inside. Ashley was at the dining table again, her laptop open, Daniel beside her, both of them looking up as I walked in, their expressions shifting in subtle ways, curiosity, calculation, expectation. "You are up early," Ashley said, her tone light, but her eyes searching. I set my purse down calmly, meeting her gaze without hesitation. "I had something to take care of," I replied, and for the first time, I did not soften my voice, I did not lower my eyes. I simply stood there, steady, present. Daniel glanced between us, sensing something he could not yet define. Ashley closed her laptop slowly this time, not halfway, not casually, but with intention. "We were just about to go over the next steps," she said, her words measured. Careful now, I walked toward the table, stopping just short of sitting down, my hands resting lightly against the back of the chair. "That will not be necessary," I said, my voice calm, not raised, not sharp, but absolute. The silence that followed was different from the others, not uncertain, not waiting, but final. Daniel straightened slightly, confusion clear in his expression. Ashley's composure held for a moment longer, then shifted, just enough to reveal the tension underneath. "I think there may be some misunderstanding," she began, but I did not let her finish, not by interrupting, but by continuing, steady and unyielding. "There is no misunderstanding," I said, meeting her eyes directly. "Nothing in this house, or connected to it, moves forward without me." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything I had learned, everything I had seen, and everything they had assumed I would never understand. Daniel looked at me then, really looked, as if seeing me clearly for the first time in years. Ashley said nothing, her silence more revealing than any response, and I did not need to say anything more. I stepped away from the table, turning toward the hallway with the same quiet control I had carried from the beginning. Because this was never about raising my voice or proving a point. It was about standing exactly where I had always been, and letting them realize, far too late, that I had never left that place at all.